I first of all would like to thank Mark for inviting me once again to participate in your series of activities, especially in bringing Asia to Europe. Uh, Sitting there, we thought with Professor Hinton, what is Asia? What is East Asia? What really do you mean when you say Asia? Well, the Asian Development Bank, which is situated in Manila, has very, very clear ideas when they talk about Asia. They have North Asia, they have Northeast Asia, they have West Asia, they have Central Asia, but I won't complicate your map. I'll just stick to Southeast Asia because that's where I belong. I'm particularly pleased also to share with you what is going on in our area of the world through the development of the region through what is known as soft power and cultural diplomacy. And perhaps this is what was not said for in the initial discussion. Really, if you look back at what has kept the peace in the region, especially our region, Southeast Asia, it has been this soft power relationships with the countries that comprise the ASEAN region. And we like to make sure that you know what I'm talking about. These are the countries of Southeast Asia, and these are the countries of the ASEAN group of countries. And as you can see, you have Brunei, Darussalam, you have the Philippines, you have Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. Of course, in Europe, they insist to call it Burma, but in Asia, we want, as the Burmese people want to call it, we call it Myanmar. ASEAN is represented by a logo, and this is part of our branding exercise. For some years, while I was Director General of ASEAN in the Philippines, we had debates on how the logo should look like. When we were initially 5, that was very easy. So you have one rice stalk and 2 rice stalks at the sides. Then we became 6, so we added 3 on one side and 3 on another side. When we became 10, there was a very strong move to change the logo. I said, why do you have to change the logo? It looks okay. He says, well, it looks like a fat lady trying to make her waist a little bit smaller than what it really is. But I said, well, that's open to interpretation. But I think, don't start imagining what you're seeing. But I think the rice stalks are very typical of the region. We are 10 countries that eat rice 3 times a day. So that should be able to explain why we stuck to this logo of the 10 rice stalks. What happens when we have 1 more or 2 more? I would like to think that it will stay 10 for a while, at least perhaps in my lifetime, because managing 10 is already quite a problem for us, and it has its advantages. But we like to keep the spirit of being a group of contiguous countries. And this is what I'm going to talk about. The first 5 members of ASEAN, of course, known as the founding fathers, are Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Now, how did we get started? I think this is where you would see the effect of what soft power or cultural diplomacy had to do with the way we evolve as a regional grouping. I'm told, and documents document this, said that these 5 ministers decided to get together in Bangkok in 1967. They had known each other in many other regional groupings, but the regional groupings that we used to belong to were not really our own idea. they came from outside the region. We had the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was a very military kind of a grouping. We had Mafilindo, we had ASA. And finally, 5 gentlemen decided, why don't we get together, just 5 of us, and see what we can do to bring our 5 countries together on an initiative that is strictly ours, with an agenda that is strictly ours. So they first went to play golf. That's what ASEAN people always do when there's a problem. They play golf, and after creating some kind of a comfort zone, they sat down in the evening and said, let's have a declaration. So who's going to do it? Well, normally we assign it to the host country. Not only do you pay the dinner bill, you also make the declaration. So they sat down with their assistants and drew up a 2-page declaration. Think that this was a declaration. It was not a legal instrument or a paper that gave a juridical personality to ASEAN. It was the expression of intentions. 3 things that they decided to include in that declaration. First, they expressed a common determination not to allow disputes between and among them to develop into conflict. If you know your Southeast Asian history, there had been periodic conflicts, mainly border conflicts between and among these countries. Philippines had a border problem with Malaysia over North Borneo. Thailand had a border problem with the southern Thailand with Malaysia. And of course, the border problem between Indonesia and parts of the Philippines as well, but not very, very serious. And of course, you saw the birth of Singapore, which came out of Malaysia. So first, they decided, let's not fight over what we consider our internal disputes. Second, let's work for common purposes. And this gave rise to a major word in ASEAN relationship, which is cooperation. Let's work together on whatever issues we would like to decide to do. And thirdly, in view of the situation in Southeast Asia at that time, they decided to avoid being involved in the competition of the big powers that were jockeying for position in Southeast Asia. Remember, this was the time of the Vietnam War. The Philippines was used as a staging airport. Clark Air Base was a major center for sending out troops. Thailand also had its bases that were feeding into the American presence engagement in Vietnam. And there were other flashpoints in the area. And we decided then, at least these 5 gentlemen decided, okay, let's get together, let's cooperate with each other, and let's stay away from the big power rivalries in the region. It's for this reason that perhaps the presence of some American bases in the area kept the leaders from meeting. They just relied on the foreign ministers, and it was not until 6 or 7 years later that the leaders decided to meet because of this situation where some members were being used for other purposes of the powers that had interests in the region. So these were the 3 plain intentions of the 5 ministers as they created an atmosphere of considerable comfort and confidence in dealing with each other. On its 40th year, which we celebrated in 2007, 40 years. Some people say life begins at 40. ASEAN decided to formalize the organization by agreeing to a charter rather than a treaty. I always like to tease our European colleagues when we said, you know, we saw how you had all these difficulties with the treaty. So we learn from your mistakes. We just have a simple charter, and we let the summit leaders get together, and it was signed in a wonderful island in the Philippines called Cebu. I suppose nobody objected to that whole atmospherics of agreeing to a charter that will give a legal and a juridical personality to the organization. In spite of the absence of such a legal document, I think the spirit to move on, in keeping with the original agreement of the 5 foreign ministers, continued. So the charter came, we had big celebrations, but it didn't really change much of the relationship. We kept at it, except that now the UN recognizes us as a legal organization, and perhaps that helps. Why did we not do this from the beginning? You know, I remember having entered the Foreign Service in those years. We could not speak about, we could not utter the word integration in ASEAN. This was a no. I remember that word because I made my master's degree on the myth of integration in ASEAN. So I spoke about it and researched about it, and you could sense that there was still a lot of suspicion between and among the countries of the region that they did not allow the word integration into the vocabulary of the meetings of ASEAN. However, we had all the cooperation agreements, we had all the intentions to work together, but in the atmosphere of what we call friendly persuasion. We did not vote on issues. We agreed on them. If somebody disagreed, he just kept quiet. Isn't that nice? But if somebody's quiet, then we sense that there is some objection. So what do? We play golf. We come back, everybody's talking, and we make it. I think, I've been with ASEAN for 40 years of my career, and I know how we managed these situations, that whenever you have an idea, you tell 2 or 3, and they carry on, and the rest will agree. Because there was no such formality in the way we evolved, there was no legal instruments except, of course, the declaration, which was not really legal because it was a declaration. We thought of a treaty of amity and cooperation to formalize more or less the kind of relationship we had vis-a-vis other countries. It was not really to bind us together, but in terms of giving us a personality, not necessarily legal, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. If one can go by the definition of soft power, which according to a BBC report, I told you the BBC is having this series of reports on soft power, can be defined as power of persuasion. That's how BBC defines it. ASEAN can be ranked highly for exercising soft power at every single step in building in what we now know as the ASEAN community. You listen to the difference between using community with a big C and a small c. Now we have graduated into an ASEAN community with a big C, but we have not yet graduated to an East Asian community. It's still the small letter C. So how did ASEAN grow from a simple declaration of intentions to the most successful regional organization in Asia today? You have to forgive me, I'm not very shy when I say this, but I think it is the most successful regional organization you can find in Asia today, and perhaps with due respect to the EU, perhaps second to the EU. To substantiate this statement, let me give you a few reference points to remember. As I've said, there are 10 countries that are geographically contiguous to each other. There are some countries in the region that had wanted to join us, but they are not physically, we don't share borders, therefore it does not comply with what we thought as physically contiguous. You have to be part of that regional, within reach kind of geographic situation. Our total population is 592 million, very close to that of the European Union. The difference is that we are a young region. 49 or 50%, nearly 50% of our population is between 20 to 50 years age group. So that makes a slight difference, I think, with the European Union. Our GDP of US 1.491.691 million. What is that, trillion? And we have maintained, I believe, a positive rate of growth even at the height of the financial crisis. A great leader, perhaps a little note on the financial crisis that had recently taken place. Perhaps it's because we learned our lessons earlier from our 1997 financial crisis. I believe that that taught us a lesson early on, that we even decided, when we saw the signs, to set up what we call a Chiang Mai initiative for everyone in the region to put their money together and matched by the funds of our partners such as Japan and our other regional partners. That is taking a very slow, it's moving very slowly. There are certain objections to it. But looking at what's happening in Europe today, perhaps we have more reason to strengthen our multilateral financial initiative called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is a standby fund for whoever needs it very badly and urgently when a situation like what is happening in Europe would take place. One of the great leaders of ASEAN, Lee Kuan Yew, once said that in order to understand the present and anticipate the future, one must know enough of the past, enough to have a sense of history of a people. I think this is very true when you try to explain what ASEAN is today. Let me therefore give you a picture of the group of 10 countries that comprise the regional grouping of ASEAN. Historically, colonial regimes determined the shape of what we know today as Southeast Asian nations. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. Brunei, Malaysia, and Singapore colonized by the British. The Philippines by the Americans, and Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam by the French. So you can see that that diversity of backgrounds which we had. Only Thailand remained Thailand, ruled by a Thai royalty. Moreover, race, ethnicity, and religion, as well as territorial disputes, straddled national boundaries, which really made nation building within each country, even within each country, rather challenging. However, one should not forget that Southeast Asians had been interacting with each other even before the colonial powers came, through trade, cultural exchanges, and human contacts. You know, are there Germans in the crowd? I like to speak about Philippine-German relations. And they said, how did our relations start? Well, I said, it started in 1521. They said, what? You mean the Germans were there in 1521? I said, no. Magellan, who was then an explorer, was a Portuguese, Ferdinand Magellan, of course. He went to the Portuguese king and said, look, let's beat the Spaniards. Let's try to look for a shorter way to get to the Spice Islands. Portuguese king said, sorry, I don't have money. Go to the Spanish king. You might have better luck. So he went to the Spanish king, and Queen Isabella said, well, I have some money. I'll give you the ships, but I don't have the rest of the funds to take you there. I give you 5 or 6 ships, but that's all. But there is a guy in Augsburg, Germany, who can perhaps lend you the money. So he went to Augsburg and met Jakob Fugger. And Jakob Fugger lent him the money, and that's how Philippine-German relations started. I like to go all the way back to history, but I thought there was some relevance to that. Indeed, Southeast Asia is a far more diverse group of nations than what you find in Europe. We are so diverse in many ways, such as race and ethnicity, as I've said, in the role of religion in political as well as social life, in the legal and political systems and modes of governance, in levels of economic development and approaches to development, in values as well as in historical experiences, culture, and so many other differences. So why, you may ask, with all these differences, did ASEAN decide to get together? Perhaps the following words of one of the founders could readily explain the raison d'etre of ASEAN. And I quote Tanat Koman, a former foreign minister of Thailand. He said to Reuters, this is one of these press agencies, why did we do this? He says, we want to be free. We do not want to be under the influence of anyone large or small. We do not want to depend on the outside world. We want to depend on each other and every one of us. In other words, we try to create conditions of mutual help to ensure our future destiny, and we have tried to work out, and we will try to work out our problems among ourselves. So I thought that might encapsulate why we got together. It was not really just to play golf, but to really get together for something for the region. It's interesting that when you look at bilateral summitry in ASEAN, which has become a norm in the meeting of the leaders of ASEAN, in a small meeting, you can know exactly who is speaking, even if you're blindfolded. It's not in the accent, it's how we approach problems. Whenever there is an issue on the table, the Philippines in those days readily would speak out, perhaps because English was our second language, so we are prepared to speak out more openly. Philippines would say, yes to whatever is the issue, but what is the legal basis for it? This reflects the background that we have. With the American regime, it was a very legalistic society. Everything had to have a legal basis. I think this is part of the American way of thinking. You must have a legal basis for what you do. I don't know if we need more lawyers, but perhaps this is one of the things that we have learned from our colonial relationship. And the second speaker would say, yes, but what is the philosophy behind it? You can almost guess who that is. If you know Southeast Asian history, you would know who is speaking. Any guess? Indonesia. Indonesia is a very philosophical culture. Whenever they speak of positions, they talk about the Pancasila. I think this is something you would be interested to learn about understanding our region. Pancasila are guidelines, guideposts in how one should behave, how one should think, thinking of community. And the third speaker will say, okay, perhaps we assigned it to committees. Can you guess which one of the 5? Well, they say that the Thais like to divide and rule. Perhaps you see that in the yellow shirts and the red shirts today. I don't know. But this is the impression that we have. And the fourth speaker would say, yes, but I have to ask my home office for clear instructions. Guess what it is? Vietnam was not a member then. That was Malaysia. Malaysia had very strict rules coming from the Home Office. I suppose part of the British influence in the Foreign Service as well. And the fifth, last to speak among the 5 original members, yes, but what do we get out of it anyway? Guess who that is? The pragmatic Singaporean. So from that anecdote, one can see how the cultural behavior of all these 5 founding members of ASEAN come into play. But if you notice, everybody said yes. Nobody said no. Everybody says yes, but da-da-dee-da-da-da. So I think that anecdote I got from a wonderful book on bilateral symmetry in ASEAN, which I think gives you the cultural perspective into how decisions are made in ASEAN. Now, let me tell you about the ASEAN way. This is, in a way, notorious among our colleagues in the region. But whenever we cannot explain something, when we cannot justify something, we say, sorry, that's the ASEAN way. And it has to be accepted as such. The diversity I have presented within and among the nations, coupled with the long isolation from one another, as well as the circumstances of the formation of the group and the state of relations among them at the time of its creation, shaped the characteristics of the association and set what has become to be known as the ASEAN way. What is the ASEAN way? Well, we try to define it in 3 ways. It is the common preference in advancing our causes through informality, loose arrangements, rather than treaties and formal agreements. Perhaps a note to update you on this, we have learned a little bit from perhaps our European colleagues that as we move on, we found a need for some formality, such as the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, to which we all have subscribed. But if you look at the way this evolved, they were agreed upon without having a document. Secondly, it is the dependence on personal relations among leaders, ministers, and officials, and on peer influence.